Chapter 8. Dreams of Warning. The prophet that hath a dream, let him tell a dream, and he that hath my word, let him speak my word faithfully. Jeremiah 23:28. The moral and physical pitfalls in life, like the hidden shoals of a dangerous coral reef, are not easily seen. The future of a man's life is nearly totally unpredictable, and only God can foresee the events which can or will occur. It is because God can foretell imminent dangers of the future that he will reveal these warnings to his children, often through the use of dreams. In the scriptures we read of many of God's warnings to man. God came to Abimelech in a dream by night, and made it known to him that he would commit a sin if he took Sarah from Abraham, because she was his wife. Gen. 23. Then God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night, and warned him against attempting to bring vengeance on Jacob. Gen. 31:24. Nephi said that the Lord commanded my father, even in a dream, that he should take his family and depart into the wilderness. 1 Nephi 2:2. Because Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. A secret combination threatened the life of Omer, therefore the Lord warned Omer in a dream that he should depart out of the land. Ether 9:3. Recorded in the New Testament is the warning given to Joseph to take the young child, Jesus, and his mother, and flee into Egypt. Matt 2:13, to save his life. Joseph was also warned that he should not go to Jerusalem on his return. Being warned of God in a dream, he turned aside into the parts of Galilee. Matt 2:22. Also the wise men being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. Matt 2:12. Pilate's wife tried to warn her husband and said, "Have thou nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him." Matt 27:19. From these accounts of dreams recorded in scriptural history, we learn that often dreams are given by God for a guide or warning. It is therefore necessary that these kinds of dreams should be carefully regarded because of their importance to our safety from physical or spiritual dangers. A most remarkable dream revealing the work which God had begun in these last days was given to an elder by the name of R.L. Mills. He wrote his manifestation in the pages of the Millennial Star, perhaps as a warning to the wicked who would reject the light of the restored gospel. The restored gospel. After the evening's meeting, I walked over to Melksham with Brother Ellis, where we sang several hymns, took supper, and offered up thanks to God for our preservation through the day. It was about 11 o'clock when we retired to rest. I soon fell asleep, and as I slept I dreamt I was in a very large field, wherein were a great multitude of people. Immediately a man, the very man that I am now laboring with, Brother Rees, whom I had never seen before in my life, came to me as I stood alone in the field, for the multitude were a great way off, though in the same field, for the field was very large. The multitude were walking towards the east. I and my companion walked north for the purpose of being alone, as we were both desirous of making ourselves acquainted with each other, and where we were going. He said he was here for the purpose of making known to the people the work which God had begun in these last days, a work with which he supposed I was some little acquainted. I told him I should like to know who that multitude of people were. He said he did not know, but said that we should pray to God to make it known to us. This we did, and after praying, we understood and became satisfied in our own minds that they were an oppressed and downtrodden people, seeking deliverance from the bondage and thraldom of their masters. Just at that time the multitude came towards us, and we turned to meet them. As we were walking towards each other, a few very large drops of rain fell, and all stood gazing, being astonished to see the drops of rain fall, while not a cloud could be seen. All this time the light was very bright, but there was no sun. The rain ceased. It did not last above 1 minute, but it fell in the largest drops I had ever seen. Immediately after the drops of rain had fallen, a tremendous clap of thunder burst over our heads. Such a one I never before had heard, nor can I well describe it. It was so terrific. The earth shook to the very center, and we were afraid, and wished it were over and past. Meanwhile we looked a little west of where we then stood, and there was a large wood, from which came a great noise, adding to the noise of the thunder. In that wood grew the finest, the highest, and the largest trees I had ever seen, and as we looked upon it, partly admiring and partly terror-struck by the thunder, lo, with one tremendous crash, the whole wood fell to the earth. The terrible shaking, the awful roar of the thunder, and the breaking up of the wood lasted, I should think, about 3 or 4 minutes, after which there was a lovely calmness all around. It filled my heart with joy to think, too, that not a soul of all the multitude, nor either of us, was hurt. I and my companion then looked upon the fallen wood, and really it was wonderful to behold the largest trees I had ever seen broken off close to the ground, and little ones in which no one would have thought wind or thunder, lightning, or even fire from heaven could have lodged sufficiently to have destroyed them so quick. But it was so. Indeed, it was here trending, and we mourned over it, and could not refrain. Beyond the wood was a beautiful country, and the multitude appeared to be going there. It was a long way off, for the wood was very large, and I thought if ever they crossed that awful scene of devastation, it must be by the same omnipotent hand that had destroyed it. This was westward, but our attention was now drawn eastward by a cloud that was ascending very gradually, beyond the lofty hills that stood in the distance in that direction. This cloud was very black, although at first not larger than a man's hand. It continued to ascend until it got about the height that the sun gets in 2 hours after it rises. Here it stood still and increased in size until it appeared in our view as large as a good-sized field. By that time its darkness became so intense that the earth was darkened by it. The heavens also appeared black as far as we could see. In the midst of the cloud there now appeared a white spot, which increased until it became as large as a small doorway. In the midst of the white spot there stood a child of very ordinary appearance. The child grew, and as it grew, I saw several tokens that it manifested of a superior intellect it had to any other child I had ever seen. The child grew till it became twice as large as an ordinary man. The white spot increased, and continued to absorb the black cloud. As this work of absorption was going on, the child, or rather the man, exhibited a lion, which he took from behind him. The lion appeared to be conscious of what was going on, and was very affectionate. The man now took the lion up in his arms, and held it up, extending his arms towards us. He then addressed us as follows: "As the wood is broken up and torn in pieces, so shall the Gentiles be broken up and torn in pieces. If they repent not and receive not the gospel, for the Lord God will send the lion through among them, and it shall tear them in pieces and destroy them, even as the wood is destroyed. And if they do not repent of their wickedness and obey the gospel, not one of them shall be delivered." The lion was then put into his own place behind the man, and he ceased to speak. During the whole of this time, the brightness that surrounded the personage continued to increase, until it exceeded all the brightness I had ever heard of. It was not the moon with her coldness, nor was it the sun with his dazzling rays. It was light, pure light. Its birthplace must have been the regions of eternal bliss. From its glorious presence that solemn blackness of despair which so short a time before darkened the whole earth and sky fled as if upon the wings of the wind. But there was no wind, yet it fled, insomuch that there could not be seen one particle thereof remaining. The personage and the lion were both enveloped in the glory of that brightness, and the whole earth was lighted up by its glory. I gazed as long as I could on the awful and majestic scene, but both the personage and the lion were hid from my view, being enveloped in the light. Having become almost exhausted by the varied changes and impressions made upon my mind, and being filled with wonder and astonishment at the things I had heard and seen, I woke. Immediately I heard the clock strike 2. So that I must have been in this dream at least 2 hours and a half, during the whole of which time my mind was exercised to its utmost extent. I will not presume to make a long comment on this dream, but will make a few plain remarks, for there may be some who, although not altogether infidel in their belief, may smile incredulously at it. To such I would say, reflect upon it again, you will find it manifests the blessings of God. And when you have reconsidered it, ask him not who my companion in the dream was, for I have told you. Ask him not who the multitude were, as I have done that myself, and have told you. But ask him who the man was that I saw, what the lion meant, and where the wood was. Ask him what country it was I saw beyond the destroyed wood, and if ever the people crossed the wood and dwelt in that beautiful country. By this time it will have occurred to your minds that God has often disclosed his holy will in dreams. R.L. Mills, Mill, star 22716. A Mormon elder wrote about a dream that warned him of persecutors who were trying to do him bodily harm. His dream depicted the death of one of the apostate persecutors. This came to pass just as he saw it. Death of a serpent. In the early days of the church, it was a great treat to an elder in his travels through the country to find a Mormon. It was so with us. We were hardly in Arkansas when we heard of a family named Ammon. They were in Jackson County in the persecution. Some of the sons had been tied up there and whipped on the bare back with hickory switches by the mob. We heard of their living on Petite Jean River, in the Arkansas Territory, and we went a long way to visit them. There had recently been heavy rains, and a creek that we had to cross was swollen to a rapid stream of 8 rods in width. There was no person living nearer than 2 miles from the crossing, and no boat. The people living at the last house on the road, some 3 miles from the crossing, said we would have to tarry till the water fell before we could cross. We did not stop feeling to trust in God. Just as we arrived at the rolling flood, a Negro, on a powerful horse, entered the stream on the opposite side and rode through it. On our making our wants known to him, he took us, one at a time, behind him, and carried us safely over, and we went on our way rejoicing. We arrived that night within 5 miles of Mr. Aikman's, and were kindly entertained by a stranger. During the night I had the following dream. I thought an angel came to us, and told us we were commanded of the Lord to follow a certain straight path, which was pointed out to us. Let it lead us wherever it might. After we had walked in it a while, we came to the door of a house, which was in the line of a high wall running north and south, so that we could not go around. I opened the door and saw the room was filled with large serpents, and I shuddered at the sight. My companion said he would not go into the room for fear of the serpents. I told him I should try to go through the room though they killed me, for the Lord had commanded it. As I stepped into the room, the serpents coiled themselves up, and raised their heads some 2 feet from the floor, to spring at me. There was one much larger than the rest in the center of the room, which raised his head nearly as high as mine, and made a spring at me. At that instant I felt as though nothing but the power of God could save me, and I stood still. Just before the serpent reached me, he dropped dead at my feet, all the rest dropped dead, swelled up, turned black, burst open, took fire, and were consumed before my eyes, and we went through the room unharmed and thanked God for our deliverance. I woke in the morning and pondered the dream in my mind. We took breakfast and started on our journey on Sunday morning to visit Mr. Aikman. I related to my companion my dream and told him we should see something strange. We had great anticipations of meeting Mr. Aikman, supposing him to be a member of the church. When we arrived at his house, he received us very coldly, and we soon found that he had apostatized. He brought railing accusations against the Book of Mormon and the authorities of the church. Word was sent through all the settlements on the river for 20 miles that 2 Mormon preachers were in the place. A mob was soon raised, and warning sent to us to leave immediately, or we would be tarred and feathered, ridden on a rail, and hanged. I soon saw where the serpents were. My companion wanted to leave. I told him no, I would stay and see my dream fulfilled. There were an old gentleman and lady named Hubble, who had read the Book of Mormon and believed. Father Hubble came to see us, and invited us to make our home with him while we stayed in the place. We did so, and labored for him some 3 weeks with our axes, clearing land, while we were waiting to see the salvation of God. I was commanded of the Lord by the Holy Ghost to go and warn Mr. Aikman to repent of his wickedness. I did so, and each time he raged against me, and the last time he ordered me out of his house. When I went out, he followed me and was very angry. When he came up to me, about 8 rods from the house, he fell dead at my feet, turned black and swelled up, as I saw the serpents do in my dream. His family, as well as ourselves, felt it was the judgment of God upon him. I preached his funeral sermon. Many of the mob died suddenly. We stayed about 2 weeks after his death and preached, baptized Mr. Hubble and his wife, and then continued on our journey. Juvenile Instructor 274-75. Levi Hancock related a dream given to a woman about the Gospels being accepted by members of the Baptist Church. He recorded, "It is now May 1831. I told what I had done with the help of the Lord, for I know He was with me and guided me all the way. I found that we had nearly broken up the Free Will Baptist Church West. Mr. Rollins came to see me. I told him many names, he knew them well," he said. From that time on he did not appear to want to see me, as he had been their preacher before, and now his flock had left him. There was an old sister there that told him a dream she had before I got back there. The dream did not please him. She told him the following dream. Well, she said, she saw 2 curtains let down from heaven. While she could not see the top, she saw Levi W. Hancock walk between them until he came to a large field, and it was a fruit tree that spread its branches over a large body of land. Many people shook hands with him. He reached and took some fruit almost from the top twig and commenced singing. She saw Mr. Rollins start and run with his hat off. The fire pursued him as far as she could see. Some had left the Church of Christ, and they also ran. Journal of Levi Hancock, page 30. It is often difficult to understand why certain events in life seem destined to happen. Death is one condition which is often foreseen or forewarned. Such a dream was given to President Abraham Lincoln. We can only speculate as to why this should occur. Perhaps it was a warning, as well as being prophetic in its nature. It is interesting to note that about this time President Lincoln had written a letter in which he announced his contempt for Mormonism. He had already signed a political bill of law against a Mormon ecclesiastical law, and he had just declared further political designs against the Mormon people. In the light of such a spotted background, the Lord may have manifest this dream to him as a warning. Nevertheless, his life was to end as he had dreamed. Death prevented further stains upon the hands of this great American. Lincoln's dream of death. President Abraham Lincoln, assassinated 106 years ago last April 14, dreamed of the event about 3 weeks before John Wilkes Booth fired the fatal shot in Ford's Theater in Washington. Lincoln believed his dreams to be prophetic, and this one so troubled him that he became deeply depressed. In the dream, Lincoln heard morning sobs in the White House and was told by a soldier stationed by a casket that the president had been assassinated. This little-known story of Lincoln's extrasensory perception was recorded by Ward Hill Layman, a federal marshal who was close to the president. It later appeared in the 6th volume of Carl Sandburg's Lincoln biography. Layman, who was responsible for Lincoln's safety, made many notes, none of which he published himself, but which were published some years later by his daughter and others. The Lincoln Dream story also appears in the Civil War Treasury of Tales, Legends and Folklore, published by Random House. Layman wrote that Lincoln considered his death dream a bad omen, and became increasingly melancholy because of it. When Mary Todd Lincoln questioned her husband about his dark mood, Layman, who was present for the conversation, wrote that Lincoln told her of the ominous dream he had about 10 days earlier. He had been waiting up late at night for dispatches from the front in the waning days of the Civil War, and I soon began to dream, Lincoln related. I thought I heard subdued sobs, as if a number of people were weeping. I thought I left my bed and wandered downstairs, the president said. There the silence was broken by the same pitiful sobbing, but the mourners were invisible. I went from room to room. No living person was in sight, but the same mournful sounds of distress met me as I passed along. Where were all the people who were grieving as if their hearts would break? I kept on until I arrived at the East Room, which I entered. There I met a sickening surprise. Before me was a catafalque, a stand holding a coffin, on which rested a corpse. Lincoln dreamed of his assassination 3 weeks before it happened. President's friend Ward Hill Layman, lying in state. This is eyewitness drawing of Lincoln's coffin in East Room, White House. Lincoln saw this scene in his dream, and it depressed him. Around it were stationed soldiers who were acting as guards, and there was a throng of people, some gazing mournfully upon the corpse whose face was covered, others weeping pitifully. W.H.O. is dead in the White House. I demanded of one of the soldiers. T.H.E. President, was his answer. H.E. was killed by an assassin. Then came a loud burst of grief from the crowd, which awoke me from my dream. I slept no more that night, and although it was only a dream, I have been strangely annoyed by it ever since. A shocked Mrs. Lincoln protested that her husband should not have told the story. Let us say no more about it, and try to forget, the president replied. According to Layman, on April 15, 1865, the president experienced still another dream, one which he had envisioned several times while living in the White House. Layman noted. The marshal said Lincoln felt that the recurring dream, which also came to him just before major battlefield engagements, foretold of Northern victories, because he saw the enemy routed. The next night Lincoln went to Ford's Theater. During the carriage drive, he remarked to his wife that he was happy for Icon cider, that this day the war has come to a close. Less than 2 hours later, Lincoln was fatally shot, dying the next day. According to Layman, Mrs. Lincoln cried out after the shooting. His dream was prophetic. By Bernard H. Gould, National Enquirer, May 9, 1971. While some dreams may forewarn of certain death, others will forewarn the dreamer, so that he can avoid death. The Lord warned a Cuban refugee of his possible death. The bomb in an automobile. Late in the evening of February 3, 1963, a shrill scream pierced the silence of an apartment building on Southwest 12th Avenue in Miami, Florida. The scream had come from a bedroom occupied by a Cuban refugee, Armando Jesus Cespedes. Not only did the cry startle his wife, Ophelia, but it as well aroused the other tenants in the house. Thinking something was wrong, Armando's and Ophelia's next-door neighbors and friends, Enrique and Teresita Martinez, rushed into their apartment and inquired about the scream. Armando explained that he had been awakened by a frightening nightmare, in which he had seen himself and Ophelia blown to bits by a bomb, which had been placed in their car. He had good reason for having such a dream. For more than 6 months, ever since he had arrived in the United States, Armando had been going to secret meetings held by the Cuban underground. He was planning to attend another such meeting on Tuesday, February 5th. It was to be held about 30 miles from Tampa, and Ophelia was to accompany him. In Armando's dream, he had seen his wife and himself entering their car at the site of their rendezvous, where they had gone on 2 previous occasions. Then, when he inserted the key in the ignition switch, the bomb under the hood exploded. Enrique and Teresita Martinez were compatriots of the Cespids. They knew of Armando's activities. They also knew there was a danger from the Castro sympathizers, agents, and terrorists, who actively were working to infiltrate and expose the exile underground movement. Moreover, Teresita was a firm believer in dreams and their prophetic portent. She cautioned Armando several times before they left the Cespid's apartment, warning him and Ophelia to take care. The dream was all but forgotten on the afternoon of February 5, while Ophelia and Armando were attending the secret meeting near Tampa, Florida. But when they left the other Cuban exiles and returned to their car, Armando suddenly recalled the dream. He vividly remembered how he had seen his wife and himself blown to bits. With a shaking hand, he returned the ignition key to his pocket, climbed out of the car, and went around to the front to open the hood. 2 of the others saw him opening his car hood. They walked over, inquiring if he was having trouble with his car. For a fleeting moment, Armando felt foolish as he told them of his silly dream. A few seconds later, however, he did not feel quite so foolish. One of his compatriots spotted something wired to his ignition. It was a powerful explosive which had been placed there by a Castro agent who was later apprehended. Had it not been for the bomb that exploded in Armando's dream that night in February 1963, he and his wife would not be alive today. ESP Forewarnings, by Robert Trallins, page 21-22. 2 incredible dreams exchanged between 2 people at the same time proved to be a warning which saved many lives. Death nears a submarine and a munitions factory. The English submarine crawled along the bottom of the murky sea. Its mission: to hunt out and destroy enemy U-boats. Lieutenant Ian Scott, aware that his craft was not due to surface before 10 p.m., climbed into his bunk and fell into a deep sleep. Suddenly, strangely, he was in a munitions factory. He could see women turning shells on lathes. He could hear the squeaking of driving belts. Then, in a corner, Lieutenant Scott saw his sister alone at a desk, her body slumped over in exhausted sleep. In that moment, indescribable horror swept over him. A finger of flame was creeping along the floor. He tried to shout a warning, but in vain. A tremendous explosion tore through the factory. Scorching timber rained down on the workers and Scott awoke from his terrible nightmare. Gasping, he looked around the silent sub. It was 10 o'clock, time to surface for night patrol. But as he approached the watchkeeper, Scott felt a weird sense of unrest. The watchkeeper was asleep. When Scott shook him, the man collapsed on deck. What was wrong? And then, for the first time, Scott detected the odor of gas. The men were not sleeping, they were near asphyxiation. By dousing the inert figures with water, he managed to rouse 3 men. Working mightily, they finally brought the submarine to the surface. There above, instead of inky night, was bright daylight. It was 10 o'clock the following morning. The sub had been submerged 25 hours, and all that time gas fumes had been leaking from an open vent. Had not Scott been roused by a nightmare, the crew would have perished. When the sub reached port, Scott found a letter from his sister. It told of a disastrous explosion in the munitions factory where she worked. On the same day, the gas almost wrote finis to Scott's crew. "I escaped without a scratch," she wrote. "I had dozed off at a desk in another building and was having a terrifying dream about you. I saw you and your crew lying motionless in your submarine. I tried to wake you, but I simply couldn't. The munitions explosion shattered my dream and woke me. Had I not fallen asleep where I was, I too would have been blown to pieces." The explosion occurred at 10 in the morning. By Lawrence Elliott, Coronet Magazine, August 1952, page 29. At 3 o'clock on the morning of August 17, 1966, Burton Klein, a GI serving in Vietnam, awoke from a disturbing dream about his wife, Janice, who was in an automobile accident. His dream saved her life. The burning automobile. He clearly saw Janice in their car driving along US 301 approaching Washington, D.C. He instinctively knew that she was returning from a visit to her mother. Then, as she approached a dangerous curve in the narrow 2-lane highway, he saw a huge tractor-trailer truck crossing the solid white line in the center of the road. The truck was on a collision course for Janice's car. Burton, his eyes squeezed shut, screamed. As if he had somehow told her what to do, Janice wrenched the steering wheel to the right. Her vehicle narrowly missed the speeding truck, but rode up upon the shoulder of the road, then plunged down and turned over and over until it bounced to a stop in a ravine. At once the car burst into flames from the ruptured gas line. Burton saw Janice struggling to get out of the car, but she was unable to open either door. He then saw that the rear window of the vehicle had been popped out as a result of the tumbling of the car. during its downward plunge into the ravine. He knew at once that Janice would burn alive if she didn't crawl over the seat and climb out through the rear window. He also knew that she was too terrified to think of turning around to see if the window was intact or not. She kept pounding on the doors and windows, but was unable to force them open. The frame of the car was warped and twisted, and the flames were beginning to lick through the dashboard. Burton began to cry out, telling Janice to hold her breath and try not to breathe in the smoke, and then he told her to be calm and climb over the seat and out through the rear window. She seemed to hear him. She became calm at once, then she crawled up over the seat, then across the back seat and out through the window. Just as she reached the trunk, several motorists who had seen the accident were sliding down the embankment toward her. One man gave her a hand and dragged her clear. They then started up the embankment to get out of the way of the flames, which were leaping higher and higher. Scarcely a few moments later, the entire vehicle was bathed in flames. At this, Burton collapsed upon his cot, unmindful of his buddies whom he had unintentionally awakened. When he finally recovered his wits, he told them of what he had just envisioned. They laughed and said he had imagined it all, that he had had a nightmare. Several days later, however, they learned the truth. Everything that had happened in his dream took place exactly as he had dreamed it. They read the proof of it in the airmail letter from Janice Klein. And darling Janice wrote, "I heard your voice warning me, and I knew it was outlandish to think such a thing at a time like that, when I was about to be burned alive. So when I unfastened my seatbelt, I knew it was our backquote, THING apostrophe again, and you were there by some mystic power helping me. I heard your voice and I knew you were there with me. I did as you said and I at once became calm and the panic left me. I climbed over the seat and out through the rear window, and just as I reached the top of the trunk, a man gave me a hand and told me to hurry. The car looked as if it was about to explode. He asked me if anyone else was in the car with me, and I had a tight moment of hesitation, thinking you were there, before I told him no. Then just as we got out of the way, the car blew up." Janice Klein's letter also confirmed that the accident had taken place exactly at the moment when her husband was seeing it 9,000 miles away. ESP Forewarnings, by Robert Trallins, page 14 to 15. It is strange that some dreams may provide minute details to aid the dreamer and warn him of future dangers. The following 3 stories illustrate these unforeseen hazards. Escape from a bull. A few years ago, a doctor now residing in Glasgow dreamt that he received a summons to attend a patient at a place some miles from where he was living, that he started on horseback, and that, as he was crossing a moor, he saw a bull making furiously at him, whose horns he only escaped by taking refuge on a spot inaccessible to the animal, where he waited a long time till some people, observing his situation, came to his assistance and released him. Whilst at breakfast on the following morning, the summons came, and, smiling at the odd coincidence, he started on horseback. He was quite ignorant of the road he had to go, but by and by he arrived at the moor, which he recognized, and presently the bull appeared, coming full tilt towards him. But his dream had shown him the place of refuge, for which he instantly made, and there he spent 3 or 4 hours, besieged by the animal, till the country people set him free. The doctor declares that, but for the dream, he should not have known in what direction to run for safety. Mill, star 10-107. Dangers of the Indians. Probably you, children, have all had dreams. To dream correctly is a gift from the Lord. There are many people in the world in these days, however, who laugh at dreams, and call people fools who believe in them. They seem to think that dreams did very well in old times, but now they can do without them. But we have found them very useful in these days. We lately read an account of a dream, which pleased us so much that we thought we would write it for our little juveniles. There is a sawmill a few miles from Scipio, or Round Valley, Millard County, Utah. 2 men were working at that mill by themselves. One of them, Brother Goff, dreamed one night that he must go away from there, or he would be scalped. The dream made a deep impression upon him. In the morning, being thus warned, he persuaded the brother who was working with him to leave there too. They both started for Deseret City, their place of residence upwards of 40 miles distant. They took the road which led directly to their home, and did not call it Scipio. The very morning they left the mill, a band of wicked Indians came down the canyon, and stole a number of horses and cattle belonging to the people of Scipio. Besides stealing the cattle and horses, they killed and stripped a man and a boy whom they met. When the men of Scipio followed the trail of the cattle, they found the bodies of the two whom the Indians had murdered. Not finding the two men at the mill, they supposed they were also killed by the Indians. This caused the report to spread that 3 men and a boy were missing. But Brother Goff's dream had saved himself and companion. They knew no more about the Indians coming than the people of Scipio did. Now, children, do you not think it was better for Brother Goff and his partner to believe in dreams than to call them foolish? By believing that God could warn them of danger in a dream, they escaped. But if they had said, "Oh, dreams are not to be trusted. We will not be so silly as to believe in a dream and leave our work," they would, very likely, have been killed. The Lord speaks to his people and shows them things in many ways. Sometimes he gives them visions, sometimes dreams, sometimes he whispers by his Spirit to their minds. Children ought to have their minds open to receive the teachings and warnings which the Lord may give them. When they do this constantly, they will never be caught unawares. Every important thing which they should know will be revealed to them. They will also be able to know which are good dreams that can be trusted and which are not. Mill, star 28502. The Lady of Disrepute. I have often thought that if the 5th part of the lives of our missionaries could be embodied in a history, it would form the most interesting and probably the most romantic reading ever offered to the public and, perhaps, as trying to the belief of this generation as the creation of the world. The account of Jonah or other histories accepted as orthodox in King James translation of the Bible, and life's experience has solidified as a fact that truth is stranger than fiction. I am going to offer you a singular, yet a perfectly truthful, illustration of the foregoing remarks. In the early years of missionary labors, elders were charged not to court women, and married elders were forbidden to engage women to be sealed to them when they got home. I went on my mission to Europe in 1850 as a single man, and religiously obeyed counsel, formed no engagements, and got into no entanglements. Judge of my surprise then, and realize what a comfort and encouragement it was to my faith when, after being there nearly 3 years, a prominent man of the English mission paid me a visit, and in sleeping with me one night called my attention to 2 young ladies who had come to conference, and asked me why I did not spark one of them. He remarked, "I would if I had not so many on my hands," naming at the same time 5 as engaged to him. You can probably imagine my feelings at hearing this. But there came a time when the revelation on plural marriage was to be made public, and the late Elder Joseph W. Young and myself were counseled to marry in Europe. In my conference was a young lady whom I thought would be pleased to have me. In considering the subject of marriage, I made up my mind to go to London and get me a new suit of clothes, make all preparations, and, when I returned, solicit her hand and, if accepted, be married at once, thus giving no chance for gossip to saint or sinner. Now I come to my illustration. I went to London and stopped with Sister Haslam, now in Salt Lake City. While asleep, I dreamed I saw my future first wife, her father, mother, and some other relatives, in the same old sleigh, the same horses and outfit altogether, that he used to own in the States, before we were Mormons. Snow was on the ground, as it used to be in our country. The persons were driving down a road that led past where myself and the girl I was going to ask to be my wife were standing. When I saw them, I was jubilant and exclaimed, "There come my folks. Let us go and meet them." But as they drove past, they made no halt, but all stood up and pointed their hands at us too and cried, "Shame, shame, shame," and vanished out of sight. 3 times before 2 o'clock in the morning was this dream repeated without variation. I got up and dressed, got the latch key, and went out and walked the streets of London until about 8 o'clock. When I returned to the house, I stopped at the doorstep, carefully cleaned the dust from my boots, and said, "Father in heaven, thank you, it is enough. I will mind the warning." I returned to my conference, and after some few months it was proven that the girl of whom I had thought as my wife had been for quite a time the kept mistress of the richest dry goods merchant of that city, and that her acts of attention and kindness to me were part of a plot to bring the work of God in disrepute and disgrace on me as a Mormon elder. Juvenile Instructor, 18367. The author of this book has had the privilege of receiving a few inspired dreams, one of which was a warning. This dream was given in clear reality of something that was about to happen. Protection on the highway. I dreamed that I was alone driving my car down a road at night. The lights of the car showed the road to be clear and in good condition. Strangely, the car seemed to be gaining speed. Suddenly a voice spoke to me and said, "Slow down." I could see no danger in the road, but the voice repeated the same words twice more, as though it was a serious warning to me. In an instant everything seemed to vanish into blackness, and I awoke in terror. There didn't seem to be any interpretation. so I soon dismissed it and went back to sleep. The next evening I was visiting some friends who lived in the country. It was quite late in the evening when I left. They lived on a high hill, and as I was driving down the hill, the car began to gain speed. Suddenly I recognized everything exactly as I saw it in my dream, alone in my car, driving at night, the lights on the clear road, and my car was gaining speed. Immediately I slowed down, not waiting for the strange voice to tell me to do so. At the bottom of the hill there was a little rise in the road. As I went over this rise, there was a herd of black cows in the middle of the road. I would have crashed into them if I had not been warned of that danger in that dream. Heber C. Kimball related a dream which portrayed the influence of the Gentiles upon the Mormon community. The country full of hogs. You will remember that when those commissioners came to make peace with us, we came up from the south to see them, to find out what they wanted. The night we arrived in the city, I dreamed that there was an awful flood and that the flood wood had stopped up the stream. I watched it, and after a while the flood wood gave way, and it came down Emigration Canyon, and went in a southwesterly direction. I then looked round to see what the effects were, and all at once this whole city and adjacent country became full of hogs. I spoke to the president and the brethren who were with him, and said the country is full of hogs, and they were frothing at the mouth just like mad hogs do, and I saw them running after the brethren, who got on the walls and fences in different directions, and they were jumping up at them, but their mouths were full of froth. And I was pleased to see that there was not one of those hogs could bite any of the brethren. By and by our attention was called to other business, and when I had a little leisure I looked round and said to the brethren, "Where are those hogs gone?" We looked around us, and lo and behold, there was not a hog to be found in the country. But while they were here, did they not froth at the mouth? They did, and they jumped and made a terrible stew. But I do not know that they have ever hurt anybody. They have not had the power to meddle with or hurt anybody, except those who wanted to be meddled with. Now I consider that those men and women who have suffered themselves to be overcome by these hogs are no better than the hogs themselves. H. C. Kimball, J.D. 8 250-251. Apostle George A. Smith also commented on this dream and its interpretation. The dream related by Brother Kimball, describing the multitude of hogs that were in the city, was so perfectly illustrated at the time. The town was so tremendously full of soldiers, teamsters, gamblers, and camp followers, and they floated off so suddenly that it could almost be said it was dreamed awake. That is the best way to dream. A man can many times dream wide awake straighter than when asleep. I remember once, when in Zion's camp, I was very thirsty, hungry, and tired, that I dreamed when I was walking on the road, I could see a loaf of bread, a bottle of milk, and a spring of water. It was one of the pleasantest dreams in the world, and I dreamed it while walking along the road. At the same time, a great many dreams, as men consider, are no more nor less than open vision, and a great many dreams are the result, perhaps, of fatigue, of overexercise, of overeating before retiring to rest, or some other cause. When a man's mind is illuminated by a dream, it leaves a vivid and pleasant impression. When it may be guided by the Spirit of God, it leaves the mind happy and comfortable, and the understanding clear. G. A. Smith, J.D. 8 225. Joseph Lee Robinson had a similar dream in which the apostates took upon them the worst of human forms, the ragged apostates. And now, while we are narrating some items of Nauvoo times, it might be interesting to relate some remarkable dreams that I had in the early days of Nauvoo. James Blakely, as I have heretofore mentioned, was the man who did so much preaching in the state of New York, where I first became acquainted with him. He built up several branches and baptized many converts, and had become deep-rooted in my confidence. But when he came to Nauvoo, he was not taken very much notice of by the authorities, and he was very much tried. And with the laws and others, the big apostasy, he went with them. But before this took place, I had the following dream. I thought I was a short distance from Nauvoo, where there were two log houses close together. I had been in conversing with the man of the house, but at the time was out at the bars close by the house conversing with the man. Looking up, I saw James Blakely coming upon a horse. I recognized him at once, but oh, what a feeling came over me when I gazed upon him, frothing at the mouth, with an old battered hat on, and his coat, vest, hat, shoes, every vestige of his clothing from head to foot was rusty, ragged, and tattered, insane, and traveling away from home. The situation he was in, and the feelings that I had, foreshadowed misery and death for that man. I felt sorry for him. Not long after this he went to preaching for the apostate law party, report said, and he went away with them, and I have never seen or heard from him since. Joseph Lee Robinson Journal, page 35. The prophet Joseph Smith received a dream which warned him of the dangers in connection with some men The Prophet's Dream of Apostates. In the evening I attended meeting in the 70s hall. George J. Adams preached and I made some observations afterwards, and related a dream which I had a short time since. I thought I was riding out in my carriage, and my guardian angel was along with me. We went past the temple and had not gone much further before we espied two large snakes so fast locked together that neither of them had any power. I inquired of my guide what I was to understand by that. He answered, "Those snakes represent Dr. Foster and Chauncey L. Higby. They are your enemies and desire to destroy you, but you see they are so fast locked together that they have no power of themselves to hurt you." I then thought I was riding up Mulholland Street, but my guardian angel was not along with me. On arriving at the prairie, I was overtaken and seized by William and Wilson Law and others, saying, "We have got you at last. We shall secure you and put you in a safe place," and, without any ceremony, dragged me out of my carriage, tied my hands behind me, and threw me into a deep, dry pit, where I remained in a perfectly helpless condition, and they went away. While struggling to get out, I heard Wilson Law screaming for help hard by. I managed to unloose myself so as to make a spring, when I caught hold of some grass which grew at the edge of the pit. I looked out of the pit and saw Wilson Law at a little distance attacked by ferocious wild beasts, and heard him cry out, "Oh, Brother Joseph, come and save me." I replied, "I cannot, for you have put me into this deep pit." On looking out another way, I saw William Law with outstretched tongue, blue in the face, and the green poison forced out of his mouth, caused by the coiling of a large snake around his body. It had also grabbed him by the arm, a little above the elbow, ready to devour him. He cried out in the intensity of his agony, "Oh, Brother Joseph, come and save me, or I die." I also replied to him, "I cannot, William. I would willingly, but you have tied me, and put me in this pit, and I am powerless to help you or liberate myself." In a short time after my guide came and said aloud, Joseph, what are you doing there?" I replied, "My enemies fell upon me, bound me and threw me in." He then took me by the hand, and drew me out of the pit, set me free, and we went away rejoicing. June 13, 1844. DHC 6461-462. The editor of the Millennial Star also made mention of this dream by the prophet Joseph Smith. This dream would seem to have had its fulfillment in the actions of those two men, for all who are acquainted with their proceedings know that they plotted against the prophet, and did all they could to overthrow his authority, and, finally, by apostatizing, they put themselves where it was no longer possible for him to help them to their salvation. I have given this dream as near as my recollection serves me, it being now several years since I read it. Mill, Star 26-293. Mortality presents a variety of blessings and disasters, all of which may greatly change a man's course in life. Only by the utmost care and consideration can a man avoid the disasters, and accept the opportunities which are for his eternal welfare. The character which we mold for ourselves in mortality is carried with us into the eternities. Our forefathers are closely watching over us from the spirit world, and they are deeply concerned about what we do with the heritage they bestowed upon us. That they may be proud or ashamed of how we have treated their name is beautifully portrayed in a dream of George Albert Smith. Your Good Name, by President George Albert Smith. A number of years ago I was seriously ill. In fact, I think everyone gave me up but my wife. With my family I went to St. George, Utah to see if it would improve my health. We went as far as we could by train, and then continued the journey in a wagon, in the bottom of which a bed had been made for me. In St. George, we arranged for a tent for my health and comfort, with a built-in floor raised about a foot above the ground, and we could roll up the south side of the tent, to make the sunshine and fresh air available. I became so weak as to be scarcely able to move. It was a slow and exhausting effort for me even to turn over in bed. One day, under these conditions, I lost consciousness of my surroundings and thought I had passed to the other side. I found myself standing with my back to a large and beautiful lake facing a great forest of trees. There was no one in sight, and there was no boat upon the lake or any other visible means to indicate how I might have arrived there. I realized, or seemed to realize, that I had finished my work in mortality and had gone home. I began to look around, to see if I could not find someone. There was no evidence of anyone's living there, just those great beautiful trees in front of me, and the wonderful lake behind me. I began to explore, and soon I found a trail through the woods, which seemed to have been used very little, and which was almost obscured by grass. I followed this trail, and after I had walked for some time and had traveled a considerable distance through the forest, I saw a man coming towards me. I became aware that he was a very large man, and I hurried my steps to reach him, because I recognized him as my grandfather. In mortality, he weighed over 300 pounds. So you may know he was a large man. I remember how happy I was to see him coming. I had been given his name and had always been proud of it. When grandfather came within a few feet of me, he stopped. His stopping was an invitation for me to stop. Then in this I would like the boys and girls and young people never to forget. He looked at me very earnestly and said, "I would like to know what you have done with my name." Everything I had ever done passed before me, as though it were a flying picture on a screen. Everything I had done. Quickly this vivid retrospect came down to the very time I was standing there. My whole life had passed before me. I smiled and looked at my grandfather and said, "I have never done anything with your name of which you need be ashamed." He stepped forward and took me in his arms, and as he did so, I became conscious again of my earthly surroundings. My pillow was as wet as though water had been poured on it, wet with tears of gratitude that I could answer unashamed. I have thought of this many times, and I want to tell you that I have been trying, more than ever since that time, to take care of that name. So I want to say to the boys and girls, to the young men and women, to the youth of the church and of all the world, honor your fathers and your mothers. Honor the names that you bear, because someday you will have the privilege and the obligation of reporting to them, and to your Father in heaven, what you have done with their name. Improvement Era, 1947, page 139. Heber C. Kimball's Dream of Earthen Pots representing people too weak for the fire of the gospel. According to a dream of Heber C. Kimball, some people, like earthen vessels, were stretched too thin, and although they were made of good material, they were unable to take the fire, and the difficulties that the gospel would require of them. I dreamed that I was working at my old trade of making pots, that I had a kiln, and that brothers Brigham, Grant, and others were there. The kiln was full of earthen vessels, and we had burnt wood in the arches until it became red hot, but the blaze was coming out of the flues. But when I began to look around, I saw a great many vessels, off on one side, that were not good for anything. They would not stand the fire, and began to fall in when nobody was touching them. A whole tier of them fell in at a time. Said I, "Why have you made these vessels so thin? You have made them 2/3 larger than they ought to be, with the amount of clay that is in them. Their skin is too thin, you have stretched them too far, and not given them the thickness in proportion." Do you understand that dream? The elders or somebody else had stretched those vessels too much. They had got the big head, that is, their heads were larger than the substances would sustain, and they fell and the vessels fell in. The clay was good, but the vessels were made too big in the start. We must not stretch them too much. Potters always work according to the amount of clay in hand. If it is a small lump, they make a small vessel, and make it all the way of a thickness, as near as possible. Heber C. Kimball, JD 3 162.